In the middle of the grandest hotel opening Chicago had seen in years, Mason Carter, a poor single father in a worn jacket, was stopped cold at the front entrance. "You don't belong here," Ryan Hunter barked, and hundreds of nearby guests turned to laugh. Mason didn't fight back. He only tightened his grip on the scorched wooden box and said the CEO was expecting him. Nobody believed him. But just as security moved to drag him away, Amelia Grace burst through the crowd, threw her arms around him and wept, calling him the man who saved her entire life. Stay with this story to the end to discover why one powerful executive owed everything to a poor, overlooked man. The story began earlier that same morning, in a cramped apartment above an aging auto repair shop on the south side of Chicago. Mason Carter woke to sunlight cutting through a thin curtain, his hands still marked with grease and years of old calluses. He had just come off an overnight shift repairing a failing heating system for a landlord who paid him barely enough to cover groceries. His body ached in the way it always did after nights like that, but he had long stopped complaining about the toll such work took on him. On the small kitchen table sat a stack of unpaid bills, a half-settled medical invoice from the years he had spent caring for his late wife, and an envelope bearing the polished crest of Grace Hospitality. Mason opened the envelope again, even though he had already read its contents more times than he could count. It was a handwritten invitation from Amelia Grace herself, requesting that he attend the reopening ceremony of the Grace Crown Hotel as an honored guest. She had added a personal note asking to meet him before a truth tied to a fire that had occurred 6 years earlier was made public. Mason did not expect the evening to unfold easily. His name had quietly become a warning whispered through the construction industry, a name attached to blame rather than to skill. Major firms across the city refused to hire him, and several supervisors were convinced he had been the careless engineer responsible for a hotel fire that never should have happened. He survived instead on small overnight repair jobs, not because he lacked ability, but because nobody had ever bothered to look closely at the truth behind his file. Late at night, he fixed leaking pipes, faulty wiring, and broken heaters for people who barely noticed the man doing the work. He carried that quiet burden alone, determined to raise his son without dragging Luke into a fight that belonged to grown men and buried secrets. Luke was mentioned only briefly, through a short phone call that morning. Mason reminded his son to stay with the elderly neighbor next door, and promised he would be home before Luke woke the following morning. He never told his son about the ceremony, unwilling to let the boy hope that their lives were about to change. Before leaving the apartment, Mason reached into a closet and pulled out a wooden box, its corner scorched black from an old fire. Inside rested a brass emergency key, a handwritten field notebook, faded inspection photographs, and the original blueprint for the Grace Crown fire escape system. These were things he had kept for 6 long years, not out of a desire for revenge, but as quiet proof that he had once tried to prevent a disaster that ultimately consumed his career and his name. He put on the best jacket he owned, worn but clean and carefully pressed for the occasion, knowing it would still look out of place among a room full of tailored suits and designer gowns. Mason left his apartment on a public bus while long lines of luxury cars streamed toward the very same address across the city. From the bus window, he watched the towering silhouette of Grace Crown glowing against the Chicago skyline. He murmured quietly to himself that the building had once stripped him of his good name 6 years earlier. Tonight, for the first time since that night, he intended to walk through its front doors. Grace Crown stood wrapped in a river of limousines, a long red carpet, camera flashes, and guests dressed in clothing worth more than Mason earned in a year. He stepped off the bus across the street, clutching his wooden box, and crossed toward the entrance on foot. His arrival created an immediate and visible contrast. Several guests glanced down at his worn work boots and turned away with obvious discomfort, whispering behind gloved hands as though his presence alone might stain the evening. At the checkpoint near the entrance, Mason handed his handwritten invitation to a young attendant working the guest list. The electronic system showed no record of his name, since Ryan Hunter had quietly deleted the entry from the database earlier that afternoon. The attendant grew flustered and called for a security supervisor to handle the unexpected problem. Nearby, Ryan Hunter was busy greeting a cluster of investors near the main doors when he happened to glance toward the disturbance and recognized Mason at once. Even after 6 years, Ryan remembered exactly who this man was, the engineer who had once uncovered every flaw in his hidden shortcuts. Ryan moved quickly to take control of the situation, declaring loudly that the handwritten letter could easily have been forged by someone seeking attention. Mason remained calm and asked simply that someone contact Amelia Grace directly to confirm the invitation. Ryan replied that Amelia was preparing her opening remarks and had no time to meet with an anonymous repairman off the street. When Mason pointed out that Amelia herself had personally sent the invitation, Ryan raised his voice deliberately so the surrounding crowd would hear every word. He gestured toward Mason's plain clothing and announced that the man clearly did not belong in a place like this. A few guests nearby laughed under their breath. One investor assumed Mason had come begging for money, while another whispered that the wooden box might contain something dangerous. Two security guards stepped forward and gripped Mason firmly by the arms. Mason did not resist, understanding that any strong reaction would only be used as proof that he was the one causing trouble. He warned them only that the box must not be damaged, since it held evidence tied directly to the safety of the entire building. Ryan seized on that single sentence, twisting it into an accusation that Mason was threatening the hotel itself. Nearby, Jessica Madison received a text message from Ryan instructing her to have the man removed from the property before Amelia could learn what was happening. Jessica noticed how unusually frightened Ryan seemed over one poor stranger, though she did not yet understand why, and followed his instructions regardless. Ryan ordered the guards to confiscate the wooden box entirely. Mason held onto it tightly and insisted that a lawyer be present before anyone attempted to open it. The struggle drew a wave of raised phones as onlookers began recording the confrontation. Ryan believed he could easily paint Mason as a disruptive troublemaker in front of the assembled press and cameras. Mason looked directly at him and said quietly that 6 years earlier, Ryan had also used a crowd to hide the truth from everyone watching. Ryan's face paled slightly, though he still motioned for the guards to drag Mason away from the entrance. At that same moment, Logan Wyatt overheard Mason's name crackle through his radio earpiece. Logan remembered clearly that Amelia had once instructed him to alert her the moment this particular man ever appeared. Without hesitation, he turned and rushed toward the private area backstage to find the CEO before it was too late. Amelia was preparing to step onto the stage when Logan reached her, out of breath, explaining that a man named Mason Carter was being restrained near the front entrance. She stopped mid-sentence in her conversation with the board and asked him to repeat the name slowly. When Logan confirmed it, Amelia abandoned the waiting room entirely, ignoring her assistant's frantic reminder that her speech was set to begin within minutes. Ryan was still instructing guards to escort Mason toward the staff corridor when the glass doors behind them burst open without warning. Amelia appeared in her elegant gown, yet every trace of her usual composed, distant expression had vanished completely. She called Mason's name loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. Mason turned toward the sound, and before he could say a single word, Amelia rushed down the steps and threw her arms around him without hesitation. The surrounding area fell utterly silent. The very people who had just been mocking Mason moments earlier could not understand why the most powerful woman at the event was embracing a man they had dismissed as a vagrant off the street. Amelia wept openly and told him she had been searching for him for months. She thanked him for carrying her out of the burning service floor 6 years earlier. Mason answered gently that anyone standing in his position that night would have done exactly the same thing. Amelia shook her head firmly, explaining that according to documents she had only recently uncovered, Mason had returned into the burning building 3 separate times to save others, despite suffering injuries of his own. She also revealed that he had submitted 11 separate warnings about the faulty fire doors, every single one of which had been erased from the official records. Amelia turned toward the guards and demanded that Mason be released immediately. She looked at Ryan and asked why an honored guest she herself had personally invited was being treated like a criminal at his own celebration. Ryan feigned surprise, blaming a supposed system malfunction and suggesting that Mason's plain clothing had simply confused the staff. Amelia replied firmly that clothing had never determined who deserved to walk through the doors of her hotel. She bent down, picked up the fallen invitation letter, and confirmed aloud that the signature belonged to her. Amelia then publicly introduced Mason as the man who had saved her life and the lives of many hotel workers during the fire. The very guests who had laughed at him moments earlier now avoided meeting his gaze. A reporter nearby asked why Mason's name had never appeared in any official report of the incident. Ryan interjected quickly, insisting this was not the appropriate moment to revisit old history. Mason studied him closely and realized Ryan was still desperately trying to control the narrative surrounding that night. Amelia invited Mason to enter through the main doors and asked him to walk directly beside her. Mason did not move right away. He first asked that his wooden box be returned to him. When Amelia noticed its charred corner, she recognized it instantly from an old photograph Eleanor had once shown her from the original fire scene. Mason told her quietly that the box did not only hold answers about the past, It also contained proof that this rebuilt hotel was still far from as safe as Ryan had publicly claimed. Suddenly, the lights throughout the grand lobby flickered unexpectedly for several seconds. Ryan quickly assured everyone it was nothing more than a minor technical glitch. Mason glanced upward at the ceiling indicators and noticed they were blinking in a pattern he recognized all too well. A cold realization settled over him as he understood that whatever had unfolded 6 years earlier was quietly beginning to repeat itself tonight. 6 years earlier, Grace Crown had still been under construction, the most ambitious project the Grace family had ever attempted. Mason worked as the engineer responsible for inspecting the fire escape systems, reporting directly to Ryan Hunter at the time. During one routine inspection, he discovered that the fire-resistant doors on 3 mechanical floors had been quietly replaced with cheaper materials that could not withstand the required temperatures. The smoke ventilation system had also been deliberately weakened in order to cut costs on the overall budget. Mason submitted a detailed report to Ryan and requested that construction be halted immediately until the issue was resolved. Ryan dismissed the warning outright, insisting that any delay would cost the company millions of dollars it could not afford to lose. When Mason attempted to send his findings directly to the executive board, the supporting data mysteriously vanished from the company's servers overnight. From that point forward, he began keeping duplicate records in a personal notebook and photographing every mismatched component with his own camera. During a late-night inspection, fire suddenly erupted on the service floor of the unfinished hotel. The initial cause was a substandard electrical line installed by one of Ryan's chosen contractors. The weakened fire doors failed to seal properly, allowing thick smoke to spread rapidly into the nearby exhibition area. Amelia Grace, who at the time served only as the director of development, became trapped along with several other employees inside the smoke-filled corridor. Mason broke through the lock of a mechanical room, guided the group through a maintenance passage, and then turned back alone to search for Amelia. He found her unconscious on the floor of a smoke-choked hallway, her breathing shallow and labored. Mason used his own jacket to shield her face, lifted her onto his back, and carried her carefully down the emergency stairwell before handing her directly to the arriving rescue crew. Once he confirmed everyone else had escaped safely, Mason turned back one final time to retrieve the box containing his blueprints and evidence. A small explosion during that final trip injured his shoulder and left the wooden box permanently scorched along one corner. While Mason was being treated for his injuries, Ryan quietly accessed his computer and erased the incriminating data stored inside. Ryan then altered the timestamps on several official reports, framing Mason as an engineer who had recklessly disabled the safety systems while conducting an unauthorized experiment of his own. A junior employee was pressured into signing a false statement supporting that fabricated version of events. Amelia remained unconscious throughout the entire internal investigation that followed in the days after the fire. Her father, trusting the polished report Ryan had carefully prepared, agreed to a quiet settlement designed to protect the company's public reputation. Mason was dismissed from his position, denied any professional recommendation, and threatened with legal action should he ever attempt to make the matter public. He briefly considered fighting the decision, but his wife, Jessica Madison, soon became seriously ill and required his full attention. Mason chose to devote what little time and money remained to caring for his family rather than pursuing a lengthy legal battle against a powerful corporation. After her passing, he continued to hold on to every piece of evidence, though he no longer had the resources to challenge the company alone. In the present, Eleanor explained to Amelia that her late father had privately begun to doubt the official report shortly before he died. He had secretly preserved an audio recording from a firefighter confirming that Mason was the man who carried Amelia to safety that night. The same recording also confirmed that Mason had repeatedly warned management about the failing fire doors well before the disaster occurred. Amelia felt a deep and quiet grief, realizing that her own family's company had destroyed the very man who had once saved her life. Mason assured her he held no resentment toward her personally, since she had been unconscious and powerless to influence the investigation that followed. He only wanted her to understand clearly that the current safety systems inside Grace Crown were still built upon a design that Ryan had quietly stolen from him years earlier. Mason opened the wooden box and laid the original blueprint out carefully in front of Amelia. He pointed to a critical component that had been entirely removed from the version currently installed throughout the building. If the central electrical system were ever seized by an outside hand, every emergency exit could potentially lock simultaneously across every floor. Amelia asked quietly who among the staff still possessed the level of access required to make such a thing happen. Mason turned his gaze slowly down the corridor toward Ryan, who stood quietly watching them both from a distance. Amelia decided not to cancel the event outright, since hundreds of guests had already gathered inside the hotel and an abrupt evacuation risked triggering widespread panic. She quietly asked Logan to inspect the building systems alongside Mason without drawing unnecessary attention. Ryan objected immediately, reminding everyone that Mason's old files still listed him as the man responsible for a previous accident. Amelia declared firmly that the file itself was now under active investigation and that Mason would be granted full access as her personal advisor for the remainder of the evening. During her opening remarks, Amelia unexpectedly introduced Mason as the guest of honor for the celebration. She briefly explained that he had once saved many lives, though she withheld the full weight of the evidence in order to avoid alerting whoever stood behind the current threat. The crowd applauded awkwardly, uncertain how to respond to the sudden reversal. Mason did not linger to enjoy the moment. Instead, he quietly studied the heat sensors, the emergency exits, and the indicator lights scattered throughout the hall. He noticed that several green lights were blinking in an unnaturally synchronized pattern, resembling a signal fed artificially from a central server rather than genuine readings from the field. Logan led Mason into the control room where every monitor displayed a calm, reassuring status. Mason placed his hand against a nearby duct and felt an airflow far weaker than the readings on the display suggested it should be. The smoke ventilation system was clearly operating at reduced capacity despite the control panel insisting it ran at full strength. Logan began to take Mason's warnings seriously. Together they examined the access logs and discovered that an administrator account had entered the system in the early hours before dawn. That particular account belonged to a technician who had left the company 3 months earlier. Ryan soon appeared, claiming the inspection was causing unnecessary disruption and demanding that Mason leave the technical area at once. Mason asked pointedly why the newly rebuilt system still relied on outdated command code from the original project 6 years prior. Ryan responded that all such code remained the company's rightful property. Mason then pointed out a small identifying sequence he had personally created to mark his own early test builds, a detail known to absolutely no one else. This alone proved conclusively that his original design had been copied without permission or credit. Ryan continued to deny any wrongdoing while threatening to sue Mason for allegedly violating corporate trade secrets. During their heated exchange, Jessica received a direct order from Ryan instructing her to retrieve the wooden box from Amelia's private office. Jessica slipped quietly into the room but instead noticed a printed email lying open on the desk, one that showed Ryan explicitly ordering the deactivation of the heat sensor alerts. She suddenly understood that this situation extended far beyond an ordinary struggle for corporate power. Jessica quietly photographed the email and hid her phone deep inside her jacket pocket. Meanwhile, Ryan prepared to step onto the stage to formally announce a new round of outside investment. His true intention, however, was to trigger an incident severe enough to spread panic, one calculated to force Amelia out of her position while ensuring the building itself remained firmly under his eventual control. Because Mason's unexpected arrival had complicated matters considerably, Ryan quickly adjusted his plan, escalating the level of intended damage in order to destroy the evidence entirely. A hidden control device planted somewhere on the mechanical floor began quietly overheating the wiring running through the service corridor. Mason detected a faint vibration humming through a nearby ventilation duct. He immediately instructed Logan to halt the entire scheduled program and manually open the emergency exits before anything worse could happen. Before Logan could carry out the order, his access to the system was suddenly locked remotely from somewhere else in the building. The lights throughout the grand ballroom cut out entirely without warning. Every fire-resistant door across the floor slammed shut in near-perfect unison. A brief alarm blared through the hall before falling into an unsettling silence. Within seconds, the faint but unmistakable smell of smoke began drifting quietly into the crowded reception room. At first, the guests assumed the sudden darkness was simply part of the evening's staged entertainment. That illusion shattered quickly once the main doors refused to open and thin trails of smoke began gathering near the ceiling. Ryan seized the microphone, urging everyone to remain calm, while quietly instructing security to escort his closest circle of investors toward a private exit reserved for staff. Mason immediately recognized that funneling every guest toward a single narrow passage would only invite a dangerous crush of bodies. He climbed onto a low platform and began directing the crowd into smaller, manageable groups, guiding them away from the areas where smoke was thickest. His steady, confident voice cut through the rising panic, and people slowly began to follow his instructions. Amelia publicly handed him full authority over the emergency response. Ryan protested loudly, pointing out that Mason held no official title within the company. Amelia replied firmly that competence mattered far more than any job title in a moment like this. Mason asked Logan to unlock the fire equipment cabinet using an older mechanical key rather than the compromised digital system. The emergency brass key stored inside his wooden box fit perfectly into an old lock, since Grace Crown had never fully replaced its original underlying infrastructure. Mason and Logan worked quickly to manually engage a set of backup ventilation fans. The thickening smoke slowly began to thin, though the emergency exits themselves remained stubbornly sealed shut throughout the building. Mason explained that someone was continuously transmitting a locking command from a secondary hidden server elsewhere in the building. To regain proper control, they needed to reach the mechanical floor located directly above the grand lobby. Amelia insisted on joining them, since her biometric identification as chief executive could potentially unlock restricted areas that others could not access. Mason objected, warning that the technical corridor ahead could prove genuinely dangerous under these conditions. Amelia firmly stated she refused to let him risk his life again inside her family's own building without someone standing beside him. Before they departed, Jessica intercepted Amelia in the hallway. She handed over her phone containing the photographed email and admitted that Ryan had personally ordered her to steal the wooden box. Jessica did not yet understand the entirety of his plan, but she confirmed that Ryan maintained a private control room that appeared nowhere on the hotel's official building plans. Ryan spotted Jessica speaking quietly with Amelia and instantly understood that she had turned against him. In response, he remotely sealed an entire floor, cutting Mason and Amelia off completely from Logan. Mason guided Amelia carefully up a narrow service stairwell lit only by dim emergency lighting. The rising smoke stirred painful memories of the earlier fire, and Amelia's composure began slipping away beneath the weight of fear. Mason did not pull her forward roughly. Instead, he asked her gently to focus on steady breathing and to keep one hand resting against the railing to maintain her sense of direction. Amelia confessed that for 6 long years she had suffered recurring nightmares about the man who saved her, unable to recall his face clearly until tonight. Mason told her softly that she did not owe him a lifetime of gratitude weighing on her conscience. What mattered now was ensuring that no one else was ever treated the way he had been treated. Down in the grand lobby, Logan and Jessica worked together to organize guests toward the areas with the least amount of smoke. Ryan continued pretending to assist the evacuation while secretly preparing to slip away through a private elevator reserved for executives. That elevator, however, refused to respond, since Mason had already cut its priority power supply to prevent it from becoming a hidden trap for anyone trapped inside. Frustrated and increasingly desperate, Ryan was forced to return to his hidden control room deep within the mechanical floor. Mason and Amelia finally reached the entrance to that same restricted area only moments later. They discovered the heavy door had been locked firmly from the inside. Through a narrow pane of reinforced glass, Mason caught sight of Ryan removing a small storage device from the wall, preparing to burn it beyond any possible recovery. Mason used a maintenance tool to pry open a nearby panel and reach the mechanical lock hidden behind it. Amelia swiped her executive keycard, but the system flatly rejected her credentials, confirming that her authority had already been quietly revoked. This alone proved that Ryan had been secretly preparing an internal takeover for quite some time. Mason connected 2 wires by memory, following an old schematic he still remembered clearly, and the heavy door finally swung open before them. Ryan stood at the far end of the room, gripping a storage device containing detailed records of his hidden financial dealings. He no longer bothered maintaining his usual polished, courteous demeanor in front of them. Ryan accused Mason of ruining everything simply by showing up uninvited that evening. Mason replied calmly that Ryan's carefully constructed plan had truly begun collapsing 6 years earlier, the moment he decided that profit mattered more than human lives. Ryan admitted, almost defiantly, that he had altered the original fire report because exposure would have cost him both his career and his freedom. Afterward, he realized that skillfully managing a crisis had actually granted him even greater influence within the company. In the present moment, he had used a secretive investment fund to quietly purchase stock options tied to the hotel chain. Once tonight's incident tanked the company's value and forced Amelia out of leadership, his hidden fund stood ready to seize control of the entire hospitality empire. Ryan intended to place the blame squarely on Mason, whose old file already linked him to safety failures within the building. The fact that Mason had personally brought along his original blueprints only made the fabricated story more convincing to outsiders. Amelia kept Ryan talking deliberately, buying precious time for whatever might come next. She quietly activated the recording function on her communication device without drawing his attention. Ryan noticed almost immediately and snatched the device roughly out of her hand. He locked the heavy door behind them and increased the temperature within the server area, intending to ignite a genuine fire before slipping away through a maintenance passage. Mason chose not to chase after him right away, prioritizing the restoration of the building's systems in order to protect the guests still trapped below. He opened his wooden box, retrieved the original blueprint, and located the position of an analog circuit breaker that Ryan had never known existed. That particular component had been quietly removed from the commercial version of the building because Ryan considered it an unnecessary expense. Mason established a manual bridge connection, successfully cutting the corrupted signal off from the central server entirely. Amelia assisted by reading valve numbers aloud and holding a light steady while Mason worked with careful precision. Slowly, the ventilation system began responding properly once again. Logan picked up Mason's voice through the emergency communication line and listened closely to his instructions. Mason guided him to reopen each section one at a time, rather than all at once, in order to avoid dragging smoke back toward the main lobby through sudden pressure changes. One by one, the sealed emergency exits released and swung open throughout the building. Guests were calmly and safely guided outside into the cool evening air. Meanwhile, Jessica handed her photographed evidence over to Eleanor and urged her to forward everything immediately to the proper investigative authorities. Ryan fled down toward the parking garage, hoping to escape quickly in his private vehicle before anyone could stop him. Amelia announced through the internal communication system that Ryan no longer held any authority to direct hotel operations. Several security guards hesitated briefly, having taken direct orders from Ryan for many years without question. Mason played back a short audio clip that the control room's local backup system had automatically recorded only minutes earlier. That particular recording captured the clearest and most damning admission Ryan had made throughout the entire evening. His confession echoed loudly through every speaker connected to the grand lobby below. Hundreds of guests, several board members, and multiple reporters all heard clearly as Ryan admitted to falsely blaming Mason for a disaster he alone had caused. Ryan froze in the middle of the parking garage, suddenly realizing there was nowhere left for him to run. Ryan sprinted toward his private vehicle only to find the parking garage gate had already switched over into emergency lockdown mode. He desperately called several board members who had once benefited from his hidden arrangements, but none of them answered his calls. Amelia, Mason, Logan, and a small team of security personnel made their way down into the garage together. Mason asked everyone to keep a careful distance, aware that Ryan had grown increasingly unpredictable and desperate in these final moments. Ryan grabbed the storage device and held it up as leverage, threatening to destroy the remaining evidence entirely if anyone moved closer. Eleanor arrived alongside the police, calmly announcing that the complete dataset had already been backed up from a secondary server hours earlier. Ryan turned his frustration toward Amelia, insisting she was far too weak and inexperienced to properly lead such a large corporation. Amelia answered steadily that her greatest failure had never been weakness itself, but rather trusting a system that valued a polished appearance over honest truth. Ryan then tried provoking Mason directly, sneering that even after being cleared of wrongdoing, he would remain nothing more than a poor man living in a cramped apartment. Mason answered calmly that poverty was never a crime, but that using money to destroy an innocent person's life was always a deliberate choice. Ryan suddenly hurled the storage device onto the concrete floor and bolted toward a nearby maintenance corridor in one final desperate attempt to escape. Logan and the security team quickly blocked his path before he could get very far. Mason did not resort to violence or seek any form of personal revenge in that tense moment. He simply positioned himself steadily between Ryan and Amelia, ensuring nothing further could happen. The police placed Ryan under arrest, charging him with sabotage, fraud, obstruction of justice, and endangering the safety of the public at large. As officers led him away, Ryan continued insisting loudly that Mason could never actually prove the original blueprint belonged to him. Mason calmly reached into his wooden box and produced an old notebook containing dated entries, verified signatures, and an official notary stamp from years earlier. Eleanor confirmed that the documentation provided more than sufficient grounds to formally reopen the case from 6 years prior. Outside the hotel, reporters quickly gathered around Mason, eager for a statement about everything that had just unfolded. Many among them had recorded his humiliation at the entrance only hours earlier and now wanted to interview him as though he were some kind of hero. Mason firmly refused to let the story become a tale of personal vengeance against any single individual. He asked reporters instead to focus their attention on the workers who had once been pressured into silence and on the safety standards that had been carelessly ignored for years. Amelia stood beside him and issued a public apology to Mason on behalf of the entire company. She did not use that apology as a way to erase accountability, promising instead to open every remaining file to formal investigators without exception. A reporter asked Mason how much money he intended to demand in compensation for everything he had endured. Mason answered honestly that no amount of money could ever repay 6 years of lost dignity and reputation. What mattered most to him first was clearing his name from the falsified reports, restoring his professional license, and protecting the people who had once dared to speak the truth. Amelia agreed publicly, right there, in front of the assembled cameras and microphones. She further announced the immediate suspension of every board member who had knowingly assisted Ryan's scheme over the years. As the chaos of the night finally began settling, Amelia felt lightheaded from the lingering smoke and the overwhelming stress of the evening. Mason gently helped her sit down but was careful not to turn the quiet moment into something overly romantic or rushed. Amelia glanced at his worn, familiar jacket and suddenly remembered that very same fabric shielding her face years earlier inside a burning corridor she had never truly forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the entire incident became the central story across Chicago. Investigators confirmed that Ryan had falsified the original report, accepted payments from outside contractors, and used Mason's stolen design without any form of permission. Workers who had remained silent for years began quietly coming forward with their own testimony. The employee who had once been forced to sign a false statement personally apologized to Mason for his part in the deception. Mason did not humiliate the man in return, understanding clearly that he had once been threatened with losing both his job and his health coverage if he refused to comply. The official record was formally corrected, confirming that Mason had followed every proper procedure and had genuinely saved numerous lives that night. His engineering license was fully restored soon afterward. The board of directors offered him a substantial settlement, hoping quietly to avoid a public lawsuit that might further damage the company's reputation. Mason refused to sign any agreement containing a clause requiring his silence about what had truly happened. He accepted a fair and lawful settlement instead, but insisted that every finding from the investigation be made completely public. Mason further requested that the company establish a support fund for employees who faced retaliation after reporting safety violations honestly. Amelia offered him the position of vice president overseeing safety operations across the entire hotel chain. Mason did not accept the offer immediately, unwilling to receive a title simply out of gratitude or guilt. He insisted on a transparent selection process along with the authority to conduct independent inspections, even when the resulting findings might prove unfavorable to the chief executive herself. Amelia agreed to every condition he proposed without hesitation. Logan confirmed publicly that Mason was the most capable engineer he had ever worked alongside in his entire career. Jessica Madison cooperated fully with investigators and voluntarily resigned from her communications role within the company. She accepted responsibility for helping Ryan control the flow of information, even though she had not been aware of the full extent of his scheme. Amelia offered Jessica a lesser position instead, one focused on building stronger protections for future whistleblowers within the organization. Jessica accepted gratefully, viewing the opportunity as a genuine chance to correct her earlier mistakes. The relationship between Mason and Amelia gradually deepened through a series of ongoing site inspections together. Amelia slowly learned to listen carefully to frontline technicians rather than relying solely on polished corporate reports. Mason, in turn, slowly learned to accept help from others without automatically viewing it as unwanted pity. Amelia eventually visited Mason's modest neighborhood, arriving without any reporters or a convoy of expensive vehicles trailing behind her. She saw his small apartment, simple yet carefully kept, and finally understood something of what his life had truly looked like for 6 long years. Luke was mentioned only briefly when Mason explained that his son was currently at school and did not appear directly in the scene. Amelia did not offer to buy Mason a new home, respecting his quiet sense of personal dignity far too much for that. Instead, she presented him with a formal contract already approved by the board based entirely on his proven skill and his rightful intellectual ownership of the original design. Mason signed the agreement only after Eleanor personally confirmed that every term within it was completely fair. Amelia asked him quietly whether he still felt he did not belong within the walls of Grace Crown. Mason answered that he had never truly wanted to belong to some extravagant, glittering building in the first place. What he had always wanted, he told her honestly, was for that building to belong instead to principles that were genuinely right and just. 6 months later, Grace Crown reopened its doors following a thorough and complete safety inspection. The new fire escape systems relied entirely on Mason's original design, reinforced by several additional layers of independent oversight. The hotel established a dedicated safety training center for hospitality workers and construction employees across the region. Mason requested that the center bear the name of the workers who had once raised warnings rather than carry his own personal name upon it. Security staff underwent thorough retraining, learning to judge guests by their behavior rather than by their clothing or apparent social standing. The very guard who had once gripped Mason's arm at the entrance approached him afterward to offer a sincere apology. Mason accepted the apology graciously, but gently reminded him that the deeper problem was never one individual person. It lived instead within a broader culture that had long assumed poverty automatically meant suspicion. Amelia announced a new policy opening Grace Crown to regular community events, transforming the hotel into a genuine resource for the city rather than merely a symbol reserved for the wealthy few. On the night of the second reopening, Mason wore simple, unremarkable clothing exactly as he always had. This time, however, nobody stopped him at the door. He walked inside alongside his technical team and was greeted by staff members with warm, genuine respect rather than suspicion. Luke appeared only indirectly near the very end, when Mason received a brief phone call from his son asking what time he would be coming home that evening. Mason answered that he would be home in plenty of time for dinner, proving clearly that his new position had not taken away his role as a devoted father. Amelia overheard the brief exchange and understood in that moment that Mason never needed a life of extravagant luxury. What he needed instead was stability, dignity, and the simple freedom to live according to his own honest values. Standing together on a balcony overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline, Amelia thanked Mason once again for everything he had done. Mason told her gently that she had already thanked him more than enough times already. Amelia replied that the embrace she had given him outside the hotel entrance was never only meant for the man who had once saved her life. It was also, she admitted quietly, a long overdue apology for everything her own company had once done to cast him aside. Mason admitted that he had originally believed he was only there that night to close an old chapter of pain from his past. Now, he realized he was actually helping to open an entirely new chapter for both of them. Amelia gently took his hand without rushing into any grand declaration of romance. Instead, the two of them simply agreed to share an ordinary dinner together sometime soon, free from press coverage, board meetings, or any red carpet at all. Downstairs, the very same door where Mason had once been turned away stood wide open once more. A laborer wearing a faded uniform walked confidently through that same entrance to attend the very first training session offered at the new center. The front desk staff greeted him with a warm smile, never once pausing to question whether he truly belonged there. Mason and Amelia stood together near the tall glass windows, watching the city lights shimmer below them. The scorched wooden box now rested inside a quiet display case within the building, kept not as a trophy celebrating a hero, but as a lasting reminder of the true cost of ignoring the truth. Mason never needed permission from the wealthy to walk through their world. In the end, it was his quiet courage alone that finally forced their world to change around him. If the story of Mason and Amelia reminded you that dignity is never measured by clothing or by wealth, carry that thought with you today. Perhaps you have watched someone be judged unfairly for how little they seem to have, dismissed before anyone bothered to learn their name. Share your own thoughts and stay close for more stories about honesty, fairness, and the quiet strength of ordinary people who stand firm even when everyone around them turns away.